Look, I'm going to show you something that's going to change North American trade forever. Canada just dropped $250 million on a railway that everyone said was dead, and it's not to move people, it's to cut the United States completely out of their export game. This is the Hudson Bay Railway, 1,300 kilometers of track running through some of the most brutal terrain on Earth, straight up to Churchill on the Arctic coast. For 90 years, this thing has been a spectacular failure. The permafrost shifts, the track buckles. Floods wash out entire sections. It was so worthless that the federal government sold it to an American company for $1, not $1 million, $1. But here's where it gets complicated. On November 16, 2025, Mark Carney stood in Winnipeg next to Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew and announced something that made every logistics executive in the northern United States go pale. Manitoba's putting in $51 million. The federal government already committed $175 million. That's $262.5 million total to upgrade this railway to Class 1 standards. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. Class 1 means this railway can handle the heaviest freight trains, unit trains carrying thousands of tons of grain, bulk shipments of critical minerals, potash exports that Saskatchewan produces by the millions of tons. All of it heading north to Churchill, then straight across Hudson Bay to European markets. Zero American involvement required. Think about what that means for a second. For over a century, if you wanted to export anything from Western Canada to global markets, you had one real option: south, through American ports, American railways, American logistics companies, every transfer point, every scheduling decision, every fee structure controlled by the United States. Canadian exporters paid premiums for the privilege of using infrastructure they didn't own and couldn't control. And there was no alternative because the Hudson Bay Railway was chronically underfunded, seasonally limited, and operated at standards that made serious commercial use basically impossible. Wait, it gets worse. Trump didn't just threaten tariffs. He's been calling Canada the 51st state. He threatened Mark Carney with 100% tariffs if Canada made a trade deal with China. 100%. That's not negotiation. That's economic warfare dressed up as trade policy. And Carney looked at that threat and thought, you know what? We've been depending on American infrastructure because we had no choice. What if we built the choice? So let me walk you through what's actually happening here. The Hudson Bay Railway runs from the Pass, Manitoba, 1,300 kilometers north through permafrost and muskeg to reach Churchill. Churchill is Canada's only deep-water Arctic port connected to the National Railway Network. It's been sitting there, underutilized, because the railway couldn't handle serious volume. The track was rated for lighter loads. You couldn't run heavy unit trains. The infrastructure couldn't support modern freight volumes. And companies making long-term logistics decisions need reliability. If your railway fails every other season, nobody's building supply chains around it. But that's not even the real story. The real story is what Carney said when he announced this investment. He didn't talk about northern development or community access. He said, and I'm reading from the official statement here, they're setting the stage for a new era that unlocks the trade and transportation potential of Canada's Arctic trade corridor to serve the Canadian national interest. Not regional interest, not provincial development goals, Canadian national interest. This is strategic infrastructure with a specific purpose: to reduce dependence on American logistics networks. And then this happened. Chris Avery, the CEO of Arctic Gateway Group, the indigenous consortium that owns this railway and port, he was even more direct. He said they're building a corridor that makes American routes optional instead of mandatory. Let that sink in. Optional, not eliminated, not replaced, optional. Because here's what nobody's talking about. The United States doesn't lose every shipment. Vancouver's still crucial for Pacific markets. Some routes through American ports will always be faster for certain destinations. But what American logistics companies are losing is something far more valuable than individual shipments. They're losing mandatory dependence. For decades, Western Canadian exporters had no real alternative. If you wanted to move large volumes to global markets, you used American infrastructure and paid American fees. There was no option B. Churchill with a Class 1 railway eliminates that monopoly. Saskatchewan grain producers can choose now. Ship through Vancouver or American ports and pay the premiums, or route through Churchill with shorter distances to Europe and no American intermediaries. The choice exists. And once companies start using Churchill and discover the economics work, they don't switch back just because American ports offer discounts. This is the part that kept me up last night. This isn't just about one railway. It's about what happens when you threaten an ally's sovereignty and they decide to build alternatives you can't stop. Because Trump can threaten all he wants. He can impose tariffs. He can call Carney governor instead of prime minister. He can rescind invitations to peace boards. But he can't stop a railway upgrade in Manitoba. He can't prevent grain from shipping through Churchill. He can't force Canadian companies to use American logistics networks if they have better alternatives. And Canada's about to prove those alternatives exist. next. Let me show you exactly why this railway was considered worthless for 90 years, because understanding that makes what's happening now even more remarkable. The Hudson Bay Railway was built in the 1920s and 30s with a simple promise: connect prairie grain producers directly to European markets through Churchill, bypass expensive American ports and the Panama Canal, ship directly across Hudson Bay and the Atlantic. It never worked as planned. The railway crosses some of the most challenging terrain in North America: permafrost that shifts with seasonal temperature changes, muskeg that literally swallows tracks, extreme cold that cracks steel, flooding that washes out entire sections. The maintenance costs were astronomical because you're constantly repairing damage from ground movement. And here's where it gets complicated again. The shipping season through Hudson Bay was limited, maybe 4 months of relatively ice-free conditions. Churchill lacked the port infrastructure to handle large volumes. Prairie farmers could get their grain to market faster through established southern routes, even if it cost more. So by the 1990s, the federal government was actively trying to get rid of it. They sold the railway and port to a private American company called Omnitrax for $1. That tells you everything about how little value anyone saw. Omnitrax ran it into further decline, minimal investment, deferred maintenance. When major flooding washed out the line in 2017, they essentially abandoned it. The railway sat unusable for over a year. Churchill was cut off from surface transportation entirely. In 2018, a consortium of 41 First Nations communities and northern Manitoba towns bought the railway and port, Arctic Gateway Group. Most analysts saw it as a symbolic gesture, indigenous ownership of infrastructure that had no commercial future. What nobody anticipated was that 5 years later, the strategic calculus would shift so dramatically that the railway everyone dismissed would suddenly become essential to Canadian trade independence. Now, what I'm about to show you is why $262 million actually makes economic sense. Railways in North America are classified by track quality and load capacity. Class 1 is the highest standard: heavy freight, high speeds, maximum efficiency. Most major freight lines in Canada and the United States operate at or near Class 1 standards. The Hudson Bay Railway was nowhere close. It operated at lower classification with significant weight restrictions. You couldn't run the kind of heavy unit trains that move serious quantities of grain or minerals. The track conditions limited speeds. The infrastructure couldn't handle modern freight volumes. This November upgrade changes everything. New roadbed to stabilize tracks over permafrost, modern rail and ties rated for heavy loads, upgraded bridges and culverts, advanced monitoring systems using ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, drones, and artificial intelligence to track conditions in real time. But here's what nobody's talking about. The practical impact is transformative. Heavy freight cars, currently too heavy for the line, carrying bulk minerals, large equipment, dense cargo, will be able to use the route. Unit trains hauling grain or potash in the volumes that make economic sense can reach Churchill. The railway becomes capable of handling the kind of traffic that actually competes with established southern routes. And critically, Class 1 standards mean reliability. Companies making long-term logistics decisions need to know the infrastructure won't fail. Upgrading to Class 1 sends a signal to the private sector: this railway is permanent, capable, ready for serious commercial use. So what moves on a Class 1 railway to Churchill that justifies this investment? First, grain. Saskatchewan and Manitoba produce massive volumes of wheat, canola, and specialty crops. Currently, almost all of it goes through Vancouver or American ports. Churchill offers a significantly shorter route to European markets. With expanded port capacity and extended shipping seasons through icebreaker support, grain exports through Churchill could reach millions of tons annually. Every ton shipped through Churchill is a ton not generating fees for American infrastructure. Second, potash. Saskatchewan dominates global potash production. 95% of it goes to exports. Currently, most potash travels through American logistics networks to reach international buyers. Genesis Fertilizers has already signed agreements to route imports and exports through Churchill. Class 1 railway standards mean heavy potash loads can move efficiently. Every ton of potash shipped through Churchill is a ton not paying American fees. Third, critical minerals. And this is the part that kept me up last night. Northern Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec have massive deposits of nickel, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. Getting these minerals to market has historically been prohibitively expensive because of infrastructure limitations. Churchill, with Class 1 railway access, changes the economics completely. Mine operators can ship bulk minerals directly to European refineries without routing through American facilities. Arctic Gateway Group has already built new critical mineral storage at Churchill and shipped supplies to Europe for 2 consecutive seasons. This isn't theoretical, it's operational. Fourth, energy. The Port of Churchill Plus proposal includes an energy corridor, potentially for liquefied natural gas. gas, hydrogen in the form of ammonia, or electricity transmission to northern communities. Class 1 railway standards support the heavy equipment and materials needed to build this infrastructure. Alberta has proposed an energy corridor to Churchill. If built, Western Canadian energy reaches European and Asian markets without touching American infrastructure. Fifth, Arctic resupply. Nunavut communities depend on seasonal supply ships. Churchill is the logistics hub. Everything from construction equipment to food supply stages through Churchill for distribution north. Improved railway capacity means more efficient resupply operations, reducing costs for northern communities, strengthening Canadian Arctic presence. Add it up, and you're looking at tens of millions of tons annually flowing through infrastructure that completely bypasses American control. Wait, it gets worse for American logistics companies. They don't lose every shipment. Some trade will always use established southern routes. They're still faster for certain destinations. Vancouver remains crucial for Pacific markets, but what they're losing is mandatory dependence. For decades, Western Canadian exporters had no real alternative to southern routes. If you wanted to move large volumes to global markets, you used American infrastructure and paid American fees. Churchill, with a Class 1 railway, eliminates that monopoly. And once the choice exists, the economics shift permanently. The obvious question is, if the Hudson Bay Railway is so strategically valuable now, why has it been a spectacular failure for 90 years? One word: permafrost. The northern sections of the railway cross terrain where the ground is permanently frozen. Except permanently is misleading. Permafrost shifts with seasonal temperature changes and is increasingly unstable due to climate change. Traditional railway construction doesn't work. You lay track on permafrost and it buckles as the ground shifts. Sinkholes appear. Sections wash out. The maintenance costs are astronomical because you're constantly repairing damage from ground movement. For 90 years, this was an unsolvable problem. You either accepted constant failures or you didn't build the railway. Canada chose to build it and accepted the failures. But here's where it gets complicated. Arctic Gateway Group solved this with technology that didn't exist when the railway was originally built. Ground-penetrating radar maps subsurface conditions. LiDAR creates detailed three-dimensional models of track geometry. Drones conduct regular inspections, identifying problems before they become failures. GPS-tracked maintenance schedules work systematically instead of reactively. Land-based sensors monitor ground movement continuously. Artificial intelligence analyzes all the data to predict where problems will develop. This isn't maintenance. It's predictive infrastructure management. The railway knows where weaknesses are developing before track fails. Crews can address problems during scheduled windows instead of emergency shutdowns. The result is that the Hudson Bay Railway is now in the best condition it's been in 30 years, despite crossing terrain that destroyed previous track. And then this happened. Climate change, ironically, is helping. The shipping season through Hudson Bay is extending as ice coverage decreases. Churchill operated 4 months historically. Now it's approaching 5 or 6 months. With icebreaker support, they're potentially looking at year-round operations. Permafrost is less stable, yes, but modern technology handles that better than historical methods did. The combination of upgraded track standards, advanced monitoring, and longer shipping seasons means the fundamental economics have shifted. What was marginally viable 90 years ago is genuinely competitive today. Now, what I'm about to show you is the real strategic game being played here. This isn't just about railways and ports. It's about Canada demonstrating that American infrastructure isn't indispensable. For generations, Western Canadian exports depended on American routes because no alternatives existed. That dependence gave the United States leverage. Threaten access or raise fees, and Canadian exporters had limited options. They paid what they were told to pay because there was nowhere else to go. Trump's tariff threats didn't make Canada weaker. They made alternatives economically compelling. Think about this calculation. Investing $262 million in a railway through Muskeg and permafrost looks crazy, until you realize it eliminates billions in payments to American logistics companies over the next decade and removes American leverage over Canadian trade permanently. Every grain shipment through Churchill instead of American ports is proof that Canadian companies can function independently. Every mineral export that bypasses American refineries demonstrates that supply chains can work without American intermediation. Every dollar of investment in northern infrastructure is a dollar reducing future American leverage, but that's not even the real story. The real story is what other countries are watching. If Canada can successfully build trade infrastructure that bypasses American control, why can't they? The precedent matters far beyond this specific railway. Mark Carney stood in Davos in January 2026 and gave a speech that got him uninvited from Trump's peace board. He said the old international order is over. that middle powers must act together because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Trump responded by threatening 100% tariffs if Canada made a deal with China. He called Carney governor instead of prime minister. He said Canada lives because of the United States and showed no gratitude. And Carney's response? He doubled down. He went to Beijing. He negotiated lower tariffs on agricultural exports in exchange for allowing more Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market. Then he came back and said Canada respects its trade obligations but won't be bullied. The Hudson Bay Railway that everyone dismissed as a historical artifact is becoming the corridor that proves Canadian independence isn't just rhetoric. It's infrastructure being built, operated, and used to move billions in trade without American permission. Here's what nobody's talking about. Trump wanted to demonstrate that Canada had nowhere else to go, that threatening tariffs and sovereignty would force compliance. Instead, he gave Canada the motivation to go north, literally. To invest in infrastructure that everyone knew existed but nobody thought was worth the cost of making functional. $262 million buys a lot more than railway upgrades. It buys optionality, the ability to choose routes based on economics rather than necessity. It buys strategic independence, the ability to control your own supply chains instead of depending on someone else's. American logistics companies in border states are watching the tonnage projections and doing the math. The grain that used to flow south, the minerals that used to route through American facilities, the fees and charges and premiums that added up to billions annually, all of it potentially shifting to a railway that runs north to Churchill and then directly across the ocean to European markets, bypassing American infrastructure entirely. And here's the part that makes this even more interesting. There's nothing Washington can do about it except watch. This isn't a tariff Canada can retaliate against. It's not a trade dispute America can bring to international arbitration. It's simply Canada investing in its own infrastructure and choosing to route Canadian products through Canadian territory. Trump can threaten all he wants, but he can't stop a railway upgrade in Manitoba. He can't prevent grain from shipping through Churchill. He can't force Canadian companies to use American logistics networks if they have better alternatives. Wait, it gets worse. Reports are coming in that Genesis Fertilizers is already routing potash through Churchill, that mining companies are evaluating Churchill for mineral exports, that Alberta is seriously planning an energy corridor to Hudson Bay. This isn't speculation anymore. It's happening. Companies are making actual logistics decisions based on Churchill being a viable alternative to American routes. And every decision shifts the baseline. Every ton that moves through Churchill instead of American infrastructure is a ton that American companies can no longer count on in their revenue projections. Let me show you what this looks like 10 years from now if Churchill actually works the way Canada is betting it will. Saskatchewan grain producers wake up every morning with a choice. Route through Vancouver and pay port fees, route through American facilities and pay American logistics premiums, or route through Churchill, shorter distance to European markets, lower costs, no American intermediaries. Some days Vancouver makes more sense for certain shipments. Some destinations are faster through American ports. But Churchill is always an option. And that optionality changes everything, because here's what nobody's talking about. Once companies build Churchill into their logistics planning, they don't rebuild around American infrastructure just because Trump offers tariff relief. They've already invested in the relationships. They've already established the shipping schedules. They've already proven the economics work. Switching back costs money and time and introduces risk. The path of least resistance becomes Churchill, not exclusively, but increasingly. And that shift compounds. Now, what I'm about to show you is the strategic impact beyond just trade volumes. Canada is demonstrating something that makes every middle power watching this situation pay attention. You don't need to match American economic power to reduce American leverage. You just need viable alternatives. Build the infrastructure. Prove it works. Let companies make economic decisions based on their own interests rather than forced dependence on American systems. And then this happened. Mark Carney's speech in Davos wasn't just about Canada, it was a template. Middle powers acting together, building alternatives to American-dominated systems, not confronting the United States directly, just making American infrastructure optional instead of mandatory. India and the European Union announced a trade deal the week after Carney's speech. Canada and China lowered tariffs on agricultural and automotive products. Countries are watching what happens with Churchill and thinking, if Canada can do this with a railway through permafrost, what can we do? The precedent is the point, not the specific railway, the precedent. But here's where it gets complicated again. The United States isn't losing dominance because Canada built one railway. American infrastructure is still essential for global trade. The Panama Canal matters. American ports matter. The logistics networks that took a century to build still have enormous advantages. What's changing is the assumption that there's no alternative. that you have to use American systems because nothing else works. Churchill proves that assumption wrong, and once that assumption breaks, the leverage disappears. You can't threaten someone with losing access to infrastructure they don't need to use. Wait, it gets worse for Washington's strategic planning. This isn't just about Canada. Reports are coming in that Mexico is evaluating direct shipping routes to Europe that bypass American ports, that South American countries are looking at Arctic shipping lanes as ice coverage decreases. The Arctic is opening up. Climate change is creating new maritime routes. And countries that have Arctic coastline, Canada, Russia, Norway, are positioning themselves to control those routes. The United States has limited Arctic infrastructure. Alaska has ports, but they're not connected to the broader American logistics network the way Churchill is connected to Canada's railway system. Canada is investing now in infrastructure that positions them to benefit from Arctic shipping in 20, 30, 40 years, while the United States is focused on tariff threats and forcing compliance with existing trade agreements. Strategic infrastructure takes decades to build, but once it's built, it shifts the baseline permanently. Here's what I think is the most interesting part of this whole situation. Trump's entire approach to Canada has been based on the assumption that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. He calls Carney governor to suggest Canada isn't really independent. He threatens annexation to imply Canada can't survive alone. He imposes tariffs to force compliance through economic pressure. And every single one of those actions gives Canada more political support for investing in alternatives. Because when you tell a country they're not really sovereign, they tend to prove you wrong. The Hudson Bay Railway that American analysts dismissed as irrelevant is about to become the route that cost them billions in lost business. Not because it's better than American infrastructure, but because it's good enough. And good enough plus independence beats slightly better plus dependence. So where does this go from here? The latest information shows that Manitoba and the federal government are moving forward with engineering work. They're realigning sections of the railway. They're upgrading bridges and culverts. They're installing the advanced monitoring systems. Class 1 standards are expected to be reached within 3 to 5 years. Port expansion at Churchill is in pre-development. Icebreaker support agreements are being negotiated to extend the shipping season. Genesis Fertilizers is already moving product. Mining companies are already evaluating Churchill for exports. The infrastructure isn't theoretical anymore. It's operational and scaling up. American logistics companies are watching their revenue projections and starting to understand what they're losing. Not the volume immediately, but the leverage permanently. Because once Canadian exporters have a real alternative, they can't be forced to accept whatever terms American companies demand. They can negotiate. They can choose. They can build supply chains around their own national interests instead of American infrastructure. And that's the quiet revolution happening 1,300 kilometers north of the border. Not dramatic, not immediate, but permanent. The Hudson Bay Railway isn't just connecting the prairies to the Arctic coast. It's connecting Canadian independence to European markets and proving that when you threaten an ally's sovereignty, they build alternatives you can't control. Trump wanted Canada to accept American dominance as inevitable. Instead, he's watching them invest $250 million in proving it's optional. I'm curious what you think about this. Does Canada's bet on Arctic infrastructure make sense? Or is this $262 million that could have been spent negotiating better terms with the United States? What am I missing here? Let me know in the comments.